And welcome back. The Alliance for Families of Justice is a not-for-profit organization that's actually dedicated to the end of human rights violations inside of prisons and jails, and also building communities and families impacted by the era of mass incarceration. Their mission: supporting, empowering, and mobilizing families, as well as individuals impacted by the criminal justice system, so that they can marshal their collective power in creating a just world. Joining us, a very special guest who can speak to a lot of these matters. We're here to provide us further insight is the Executive Director of the Alliance for Families of Justice, Ms. Soffiyah Elijah. And thank you so much for being with us, Soffiyah.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And so when we talk about social justice, we talk about mass incarceration. That's something that a lot of communities continue to face and deal with, particularly in communities of color. So give us a little bit about the work that you're doing inside the prisons and the jails, trying to bring an equal and a just environment.
Thank you. So the Alliance of Families for Justice focuses on family members and people who are incarcerated to address the conditions under which they are held and the issues that arise with respect to the relationship between family members and their incarcerated loved ones. That can include things like physical mistreatment by security staff. It can include lack of adequate medical care, the banning of visits by loved ones to come see their incarcerated family members. It can include preparing people to go before the parole board, a variety of issues like that. We have a legal support unit and a family support unit that function to help family members and people with a criminal record. And all of our services are free.
And so when we talk about free services, obviously that's a benefit to both families and community, because there are a lot of challenges that come with those, particularly in the area of incarceration and those who are dealing around that whole area. Give us a little bit about some of the challenges that you're seeing right now, particularly amidst COVID-19.
Certainly. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a devastating impact on Black and Latino families, not only in New York State, but across the country. The death rates, as we know, have been much higher in those communities. And the same holds true inside the prisons and jails. Our problem, one of the many problems in New York State, is that testing is not available to people who are incarcerated. The only people who are being tested are people who come down with being very, very sick already inside the facility. So unlike you and myself on the outside, where we can go to any number of places and be tested, our loved ones who are incarcerated don't have the ability to be tested and find out what their status is. They're also not being provided with adequate personal protection equipment, masks, hand sanitizers, et cetera. Since March of 2020, families have been banned from visiting. All visiting in state facilities has been suspended. And so for many months, people have not been allowed to visit their loved ones. And the people who are inside are left with only the phones and some limited access to video conferencing to have contact with their loved ones. And for many, many people, for the 40,000 people who are incarcerated in New York State and their family members, literally those visits are the lifeline to some semblance of normalcy. And that has had a devastating impact on particularly Black and Latino communities.
And we've heard a lot about early release. There have been people who've been released from the criminal justice system, out of jails, out of prisons, due to COVID-19 in some areas, and actually coming back into the community. What are we hearing in regards to that, and how are you able to actually be a buffer for those people who are in transition?
Right, so here's what's happening. In the New York City jail system, there has been a significant decrease in the number of people held in the jail system in New York City. And that those figures are noteworthy. However, on the state level, very, very few people have been released. And those who have been released are people for whom the parole board had already made a determination that they would be released within the next 90 days. So the only thing that has happened for those people is that instead of waiting 90 additional days, they're being released sooner. but the announcements by Governor Cuomo that he was going to release some 3,000 people have not materialized. And so we have countless numbers of people who remain inside. And at the same time, because testing is not being done universally or made available to people who are inside, we have no idea of what the actual numbers are for people who are incarcerated who are positive for the COVID-19 virus. So people could literally come home from the facility and not know whether or not they're positive for COVID-19.
Amazing, amazing. And so, talking about going from here, where are we going from here, and what would you like to see done? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's on the table right now. We've been talking in previous shows about criminal justice reform and things of that nature. 50A that's actually been signed into law by the governor. But looking forward with a laser focus, how do we deal with this reopening situation that's going on, and how's that impacting you moving forward as well as the organization?
Certainly. So for the Alliance of Families for Justice, our family members are laser focused on restoring visits and having health protection for their loved ones inside. So the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision in New York, known as DOCS, which is the entity that runs the prisons, has announced that if and when visiting is restored, there'll be certain restrictions in place. And I can best describe those restrictions as draconian. So for example, remember, people haven't seen their loved ones since March, the latest. They will not be allowed to touch their loved ones when they visit. They'll only be allowed to visit for 2 hours. And mind you, family members generally travel throughout the night in order to get to the facility to be able to visit. So imagine traveling somewhere between 4 and 7 hours, and then you're only allowed to see your father, your sister, your husband, your wife for 2 hours. And then only 2 family members will be allowed to visit at any given time. So if you think of a family, a mom with 3 children going to visit her husband and the father of those children, she has to make a decision as to which of those children she can bring to see their dad. So these are just some of the measures that we find to be totally unacceptable. And we have been organizing family members from across New York State to make their voices heard and to push back against these restrictions that fail to honor the importance of strong family ties in our communities.
Yeah. And when we talk about the ties in the community, there's some great family systems that exist within our community. And incarceration actually breaks that, right? And we notice that family systems can be broken through incarceration. But talk to us about the restoration and recidivism, because the goal is not for recidivism, but the goal is to really, provide that restoration. Talk about the work that you guys do in terms of restoring families and helping them, even in a time like this.
So we have a number of things that we do at the Alliance of Families for Justice to strengthen family ties and help people to have positive reentry into society. One of those things is that we run a family empowerment circle that operates every Tuesday evening on a drop-in basis. People can simply dial into the Zoom meeting and build community with other similarly situated family members and formerly incarcerated people. We also, when we could meet in person, had an annual family healing retreat for families from all over the state of New York to come and spend a free weekend together. And it was very intergenerational, from like 2 months old to 86 years old. People would come together and build connections and bonds. We were also planning to have a healing retreat specifically for formerly incarcerated people. Originally that was going to happen in June, but because of the pandemic, we've had to postpone that healing retreat. But we are envisioning, if we don't hold those retreats in the fall, that we'll do them in the spring of 2021. So we also have one-on-one family and group counseling for directly impacted people, whether they be family members or formerly incarcerated people, to help them navigate the trauma that incarceration brings to the whole family unit.
Yeah. And I wanted to touch on that for a minute because when you talk about that family unit and trauma, very important to really recognize because it's a real issue that affects a lot of people who have been incarcerated. But then I also want to talk a little bit about family members, right? Because we always talk about those who've been incarcerated and the mental health challenges those pose. But do you find for even those family members, the mental health, the emotional health, those are great things that families sometimes have to burden, but many people are not really in tune with.
That's very true. You hit the nail on the head. We know that counseling and therapy are pretty much taboo in Black and Latino communities. And our family empowerment circle is designed to kind of peel that onion and take away that taboo and give people a safe space to address the behavioral health issues that arise and are connected to the horrific experience of incarceration. You have depression. We've seen the impact of incarceration cause people not only to lapse into depression, but then not take care of their physical health. And that results sometimes in loss of job, hospitalization, other kind of chronic medical conditions, which can also affect the economic stability of the whole family unit. We've seen this time and time again. And through the Family Empowerment Circle, providing people with a safe space so that they know that they're not alone, it helps them to navigate what sometimes could be for families, someone doing a sentence of 25 to life. That's a lot of years to be able to try to hold it together through the emotional trauma of losing someone very, very dear to you. We also have what we call a supportive voices network. Other family members volunteer to reach out one-on-one to family members across the state, whether it be with a phone call, a text message, or an email, just to check in to let people know that there's another understanding and listening voice, someone who cares that they can talk to on a weekly basis.
And so you're right in the heart of Harlem. I grew up literally down the block from you. And I know that Harlem is definitely the mecca for our community in terms of community, in terms of culture, in terms of life, with all that's going on right now, social unrest, civil unrest, talks and protests concerning police brutality. Give us a sense of the atmosphere of what you're facing right in the Harlem community right now. We know that criminal justice reform is one of the major things that protesters are talking about, and police brutality. What's the atmosphere like around the community right now?
I would say Harlem, like the rest of New York City, which I can speak to, and probably a microcosm of the state, is, I would say, a buzz. That's probably a good word. It's a buzz with anticipation and a new sense of resistance and analyzing what kind of systemic change is needed. And I would also say that I think people are getting more enlightened that the criminal injustice system has passed the point of no return for reform. And it's going to require a complete overhaul, completely starting from scratch. Just like you couldn't reform slavery, I don't think you can reform the criminal injustice system any longer. We're past that point. And so we need to be thinking creatively about what kind of systems we need to put in place that actually serve the people in the community. And I think the residents of Harlem are up to that task and certainly very active in those conversations.
Give me your thoughts about defunding the police. That's a big conversation that's being had right now. In favor, support of defunding police, particularly in NYC?
I think we need to defund the police. We need to defund the prison system, the jail system. We have seen time and time again, no one is improved by putting them in a cage. No one. We need to use those funds that are wasted on the police department to think creatively and use them to support people whose dreams have been smashed almost from birth and help them to realize their full potential and recognize that the most valuable natural resource that we have in this country and in our communities is the people.
I know one of the big concerns in our community is always talking about the decriminalization of marijuana. With all that is going on right now amidst COVID-19 and the protests that are out there right now against police brutality, against the criminal justice system, where do we think we're going to see the decriminalization of marijuana end up in all of this?
Well, I don't know that there's enough focus now on decriminalizing marijuana, but certainly that should be something that is done. I would advocate that drug possession and use should be decriminalized in total. In the same way, it's not criminal to drink, which is equally damaging to people. We need to provide people with quality treatment. We also need to provide people with opportunities, real opportunities to manifest their full potential. Because if we do that, I think people will find far less interest and need to rely on drugs and alcohol as a way to address their issues and concerns.
Yeah. Soffiyah Elijah, we're going to leave it there, but thank you so much for being a guest with us here on the Social Justice Forums.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All righty. Our guest, Soffiyah Elijah, the Executive Director of the Alliance of Families of Justice, sharing with us here on the Social Justice Forum.